YOLO composing gloves here, and today we're going to be jumping into a whole suite of effects that I think are really well demonstrated on a drum loop. Here's our general drum loop. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a couple ways we can sort of put these effects together. Now, I am using a limiter to bring the volume of the drum loop up, but that is it. So the first thing, let me just give you a couple quick audio demos. We could toss a delay on it, and I'm using something called the Haas Zone or Precedence Effect. It also happens to be the same way a flanger processes sound. So we are going to take a look at that. When you modulate it with an LFO, that is. We also have a Trance Gate, and this could be really fun. If we bring the feedback way up, can create all sorts of rhythmic patterns. And by using it in combination with the delay, the way I'm doing it here, we can actually create a melody out of this. And this is being done through an LFO. If we look in here, I've got an LFO that's modulating the levels of this over time. Now, we can use a Transient Shaper. This is actually one that I use a ton outside of Phase Plant. It's one of my favorite Transient Shapers. And I just have the attack boosted all the way. And let me just show you it dry. And now with a Transient Shaper. So we hear it come up. It's a lot sharper of a sound. If we bring the pump up, or even not even just the pump, we can just bring the sustain down. That is a nice thing. So that's the Transient Shaper. We'll look at that. We also have the ability to do some cool reversing if we like combine these. And if we take this off or even just dial it back. So we get some cool reverse effects. The gain slider, I'm just kind of including this here because I want to include everything. So we're going to talk about the gain slider. It's got a peak meter on it. That's kind of nice. And we finally, if we're going to talk about the Haas Effect, we should talk about it like properly. So this is the Haas Zone. We'll talk about the Haas Effect, which is a cool way to add stereo stuff to your sound. However, it's not mono compatible, so be careful. So, all right, let us get going. So first off, I'm going to cover the delay in a separate instance because I think it's a little bit more clear. So we have an oscillator, and we're going to load up a delay. And a delay, I'm assuming you've got what a delay is. It creates echoes, right? If we have our feedback all the way down, we only get one echo. Now, if we bring it up, we'll get a bunch of echoes. Now, with a long time here, so this is, we can set the time in milliseconds. We are well outside what's called the Haas Zone. And the Haas Zone is where you're able to tell that there are two discrete sounds happening. There's a point where one sound gets so close to the other sound in time that we have a hard time telling them apart. And when we perceive them as one sound, that's called the Haas Zone. And it has a special sound to it. So if we go down, generally for a lot of sounds, it's below 40 milliseconds. But if a sound has like a washed out attack or something, this can be extended up to 80 milliseconds sometimes. But if it's a very transient sound, like some of you may be able to tell those apart. And that's because it's easier for us to determine if two events are really defined, if they're separated or not. But generally, once we get down, really down, we start running into problems. And this also happens to be a delay range that's used to create the effect we know as flanging. So pretty dang cool. By the way, this works in real time as you're seeing, and this can create some really wild effects if you do something in the range that's outside of the Haas Zone. And then you bring it in. So that is can be a pretty fun thing if you move outside and come in. There's some ideas. We can, of course, sync this up with our host tempo. And our feedback level, we've already talked about. But if you have it at 100%, you will get endless ringing. Especially if you go for a small value. This could be really fun to mess with the combination of modulators. You can move this up move this around, and then move it back down and create some really pretty cool sounding loops. So there's some ideas for you. Ping pong is a really common setting. It causes the delay to go from one side to the other side. And in this case, it's pretty much an instant ping pong. There's not like a control to smooth it out. It's like here and then here. And it requires stereo information for this to work. So if I play right now, our sound is mono. Let's turn that down. So it has no effect really. But if we turn on ping pong and pan it a bit, we can hear it jumping back and forth. So that's ping pong. And finally we have, this is a really cool setting, which allows us to make basically release triggers. If you're into contact and designing instruments, a release trigger is a sound file that triggers when you let go of a note. So like if you're playing guitar, it'd be like the sound of the guy or girl taking their finger off of the guitar. Some libraries are that detailed. So ducking, what it does is it ducks the sound of the delay until we let go of the note, and then it lets it come through. So we can duck it a little bit, or we can duck it 100% and basically make a release trigger. And let's turn the panning back to normal. And perhaps an even shorter, and bring our feedback maybe up even more. So you can hear. So that could be a fun thing to play with. That's what ducking does though. And then we have a mix. So all these things are pretty straightforward. Let's dive into that example that I was showing you earlier with the drum loop. So here I'm taking advantage of the Haas Effect. And what I'm doing here is I have created a modulation that moves around at various levels and causes it to change the delay here. Now we'll get into LFOs more later because I know it could be a bit confusing with figuring out what exactly your numerator and denominator should be. But this allows us some pretty cool controls when it comes to moving the delay around. So that's the delay effect at work. Of course, you could do this with like a bass sound or something. You get some pretty cool loops going. All right, let's move on to the Trance Gate. So the Trance Gate, essentially, it's pretty straightforward. It's a series of gates, so it triggers an envelope basically on every other one in this case. And we're able to set a resolution. This is how fast it goes around. So if we have it at like 132, it's like very much faster. And each one of these gates has an envelope, and we can have different patterns here. So pretty nice. But on this envelope, we have an attack, decay, sustain, release. So it's just like a regular old envelope that you would expect. But this is what's going to characterize this. So if we have a long release on these gaps will be less important because our release will bleed over. So you can see how they're coming over. If we have our sustain up, we get a really defined thing if our release is low. And if our sustain is low, we basically have an AD envelope. So pretty straightforward stuff here. This is one of the much more simple modules. And it's one that's more fun when you start combining it with things. We could slow this down. And we could change the number of steps. And that's where this gets really kind of interesting. Because if you do like 17 steps, this will have a very unusual pattern with anything you do in 4, right? So pretty cool stuff here. Transient Shaper. Our Transient Shaper here is a drum shaping plugin. Well, it's just a transient shaping plugin. So it's like a very special compressor that's designed to deal with these sharp edges on sounds and really shape them up, because when we have like a kick drum, there's a lot of definition in the way that initial sound hits. It's even got a special name, if I can remember it. It's the chiff. The chiff is the name of the beginning of a sample, especially on things like drums, because they're very hard to replicate, or like the way a flute player initially blows on their instrument. So if that is what's a transient means a moment of excitement. So it's like a moment where the audio peaks. This is going to be detected by this. It's better at detecting that. And it's very, very visual. We can bring up the attack. We can remove the attack. We can also add pumping, which is like a dip before it comes up. So we have an attack boost and then a volume dip. which can create a really nice forward effect if you want like a really aggressive choppy loop. Or not choppy, but like you can get a choppy loop if you put it all the way. And then sustain. Now, sustain's the one that's really fun if you just take it away. You're just left with those loud moments. If we go the other way, you get a very sustained loop. We can also control the speed at which this happens. I sort of leave this at default most of the time, but I could probably move it forward actually. That's just how fast it progresses through our envelope here. And we can also clip stuff. And clipping, what it does is basically I view it as a type of normalization. Let me play it without it and listen for the hi-hat. And now we turn it on and all those moments will become loud. Anyways, you get the idea. If you read the description, like its official description, by the way, you can hover over knobs and it'll tell you, is it clips to 0 dB, which I view as just a normalization because these things weren't reaching 0 dB in the first place. It's also got a sidechain input, which is something I don't use as much because usually I use this as a drum shaping device. And that is the Transient Shaper. These are all very straightforward effects that I toss on to just shape up the sound, get it to exactly where I want it. We have a reverser plugin, which will reverse a chunk of audio. We can crossfade where these chunks happen. I mean, it's in sync mode, but we could set this in milliseconds. And right now I'm automating the mix knob with a LFO as well because I don't want this on all the time. It would sound ridiculous. Now, that's it with just an arbitrary millisecond setting. I find sync to be very useful. If we bring up the crossfade, we'll hear yeah. And this, by the way, this can like come up all the time because it's got to go through whatever it's recorded. Because it records it basically and then reverses it is how I understand it to work. That's with a large crossfade. With a no crossfade. So moments like that where this initially turns on will benefit from this. So I should have my crossfade up actually a bit more than I currently do. But I had this on. I had these three on in combination. These three on in combination. We got this. Let's get rid of the Trance Gate. I had a different setting for the Trance Gate going. Mine was at 8 and 16. So I've readjusted the Trance Gate's envelope a little bit to do a little bit more of what I want. So I'm blurring these together a bit more, and this just creates more of a pumping kind of an effect, which is something I could accomplish maybe a bit more with a compressor. But here it's been rhythmically synced, which is sort of one of the reasons you would grab a Trance Gate, right? It's the whole point of this. So anyways, those are those. Now I have a couple here that are very, very simple plugins, even more simple, because each one of these things sort of just specializes in its one thing, and then that's it. So we have a gain option here. This is just a plugin for gain. That's it. It's just a utility. Double click to reset stuff and you get a peaking meter. Now in the latest version, 1.7.5, they actually added an RMS meter and actually fixed several of the readings on the master meter. So I bet at some point those same improvements will be seen in the gain knob area. Or gain slider. I'm sure what you would call this. Gain interface. There's no knob or slider. What is this? So that's the gain. And then finally the Haas. Now if you don't know what the Haas effect is, it's when you put a delay in the Haas zone between your two speakers. So it's before we can hear them as discrete sounds. And because it moves that fast, we perceive it as a spatial image instead of two sounds coming at us individually. So it might come out the left speaker and then come out the right speaker. I did that backwards. But to you, I think it'll look correct. It'll come out the right speaker and then it'll come out the left speaker maybe 10 milliseconds later. And that creates an image in our head. It helps us spatially position things. So we can change it. See, very, very small, 0.4 milliseconds. See, when we do beyond 40, definitely beyond 40, we're at 60 right now. it sounds like there's two sounds going on, and it's more like an actual delay. But you can hear it coming out both one channel, one right after the other. So there you go. And we can, of course, choose which channel. I believe this selects which channel it comes out first. Which channel to delay. So this chooses the delayed channel. But the Haas Effect, a couple knobs, if you know what it is, it's really easy to put on there. Caution with it, it's not mono compatible because you're basically asking for flanging when you sum this back together. Or at least you're asking for comb filtering because it's not moving back and forth. It's just been delayed statically. So you'll get a very filtered sound with phase cancellation and whatnot if you are going to go back to mono. I use the Haas Effect a lot, though. Most people listen over headphones and whatnot. These days, there are other ways of getting mono-compatible stereo widening. Like, for example, they provide the comb filter option that we explored if you're really concerned about it. But a lot of times also when you have so much in a mix, it doesn't stack up as much as you thought. You'd want to be more careful about elements that are big elements, like maybe a main bass sound or perhaps like your main vocal. Those are things that you may want to be a little more concerned with. But if it sounds good, it is good, right? That's the rule. But we could, of course, do a comb filter and turn on stereo. Get a stereo image that way as well. So that is all of these snap-ins. I know I covered quite a few of them, but they're just sort of things, they're like little things that I toss in a lot of patches. You could make patches based on them, like one that's really focused around the Trance Gate effect or something that really messes with the reverser. But I sort of want to just put them all together because you'll see them sprinkled more often than not. I don't typically sit down and do that unless I specifically want to do that. It's more usually the general notion of why I would grab this. So like the Transient Shaper, I don't grab a lot actually in phase plant, but I grab it a ton when I'm working with drums because I love what it does to drums or other material. Maybe I have like a bass line that's really edgy and has a lot of really staccato moments, then this would be a great thing to put on it and experiment with that. If you have any questions about this stuff, let me know, subscribe, and have a blessed day.